Who would you rather have perform a life-saving open-heart surgery on you? Surgeon number 1 or surgeon number 2? And before you make this decision, here's some information about both surgeons. The surgeon number 1 has performed this surgery various times throughout his career. And out of all the times he's performed it, never once has he had any problems arise. And because of his glowing success rate, he's known in the medical field as being the expert on this very procedure. Whereas surgeon number 2, well, he's performed this surgery a handful of times throughout his career. But out of the few times he has performed it, well, he's had a couple times where some problems have arisen, and it hasn't always gone as smoothly as he would have hoped. So which surgeon would you rather have perform this life-saving operation on you? Which is really a foolish question when you think about it, because obviously you'd go with surgeon number 1, and you go with surgeon number 1 because he has proven himself to be the right man for the job. And leading up to our verses for today, well, Moses thought that he was the right man for the job. The job being delivering the Israelites from their slavery in Egypt. And the reason Moses thought that he was the right man to do this work is because of the unique upbringing that he had. You see, while Moses was an Israelite, he was raised as an Egyptian. And this is all because of a decree that the king of Egypt had put into place at that time, stating that all Hebrew boys who were born needed to be thrown into the Nile River. But Moses' mom didn't throw him into the Nile River. She placed him in a basket that happened to float down the river, and it just so happened that it floated right to Pharaoh's daughter, who had compassion on him and adopted him as her own son. And so Moses, who grew up in the Egyptian palace, well, he had a top-notch education. He was well trained in various topics like math, astronomy, medicine, and he was also thoroughly trained in the art of rhetoric so that he could express himself with great clarity, precision, and force. Yet this luxurious life and this well-learned life that Moses was able to have growing up in the Egyptian palace didn't make an Egyptian out of Moses, that in his heart and in his soul, he remained a true son of Israel. And Moses showed this when one day he decided to go and to visit his people, the Israelites. And the author of the book of Hebrews explains what Moses was conveying by doing this. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as greater value than the treasures of Egypt. And so by going to visit the Israelite people, his people, Moses was casting his lot with the Israelites. Moses was identifying himself as an Israelite rather than as the Egyptian prince that he could have identified himself as. And when Moses went to the Israelite peoples and visited them, he went full of confidence, thinking that he was the one who was destined to deliver them from their slavery in Egypt. And so when Moses came across a situation where he saw an Egyptian beating an Israelite slave, he thought that this was the perfect opportunity to do this very work. And Moses was going to do this work by any means necessary, so he killed the Egyptian man. And Moses thought that in doing so, the Israelites were going to rally behind him. But what happens the very next day shows that Moses was thoroughly mistaken. So the very next day, Moses was still visiting with his people when he came across a situation where two Israelites were having a dispute with one another. And Moses tried to settle the dispute, but when he did so, one of the men harshly replied to Moses, saying to him, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" And upon hearing these words, well, it hit Moses that his sinful, murderous act to try and deliver the Israelites from their slavery in Egypt, didn't do so. It didn't get the Israelites on his side. In fact, it did the opposite. Moses was a failure. And because Moses' attempt to try and deliver the Israelites from their slavery failed, well, it really left him with no other option but to flee from Egypt. And we hear that Moses fled to Midian and remained there for 40 years. And during this long span of time, we hear that Moses got married to one of Jethro's daughters. Jethro was the chief priest in Midian. And we also hear that Moses served as a shepherd to Jethro's flock. Well, we also hear during this time that the Israelites groaned and cried out to God because of their deep distress in their slavery. And God heard their cries. And in our verses for today, we see God put into place the unlikeliest of plans to deliver his chosen nation. Our verses begin. Moses was shepherding the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, a priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from within a bush. And God called to Moses from the bush when he approached, and he told him to take his sandals off, because the place he was standing was holy ground. And then he said to Moses, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Now this day began as any other for Moses. He was shepherding the flock of Jethro, but all of that quickly changed when all of a sudden he came upon a situation where there was a bush that was lit aflame, but yet wasn't being consumed by the fire. And his curiosity got the best of him, and so Moses went to the bush to explore what was taking place. And this is when God called out to Moses from the bush, identifying himself as the God of the father of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That God revealed himself as the God of the covenant, the one who promised to send a Savior through the line of Abraham. And it's really amazing when you think about it, that God hadn't revealed himself or spoken to his chosen nation for hundreds of years while they were in their slavery in Egypt. But now, after all these years, he was speaking to and revealing himself to Moses. And when Moses realized that the one true God was speaking to him from the bush, he was stricken with fear because Moses recognized his own sinfulness. But God didn't appear to Moses to strike him with fear. He appeared to Moses because he had good news to proclaim to him. The Lord said, I have certainly seen the misery of my people in Egypt, and I've heard their cry for help because of their slave drivers. Yes, I am aware of their suffering. So I've come down to deliver them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land to a good and spacious land. That God reveals to Moses that he hadn't been ignoring his chosen nation while they were in their slavery in Egypt. He heard their cries and he heard their groanings for help. And he tells Moses after all of this time that now he was going to come and deliver his people. And how overjoyed Moses must have been. I mean, really, when you think about it, this is what Moses so desperately desired for his people 40 years earlier when he tried to deliver them by killing the Egyptian man. And now God himself was saying that he was going to do and accomplish this work. But as God was revealing this good news to Moses, surely Moses must have been wondering, why is God revealing this information to me, of all people? And with his very next words, God reveals the reason why, and the reason completely stuns Moses. Come now, Moses, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. God calls Moses, the one who had proven himself to be a sinner by killing the Egyptian man, and the one who had proven himself to be a failure by not being able to deliver the Israelites 40 years earlier, to now go and to do this work once again. And Moses recognized all this, which really leads us to see why Moses responds in the way that he does. Who am I, God, that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Remember me, God? Do you remember who I am? I'm the one who gave up my position, fame, and fortune 40 years earlier to try and deliver the Israelites, but failed miserably when I committed the awful sin of killing the Egyptian man. And look at me now, God. Back then, I was an Egyptian prince. Back then, I was well learned in various topics. Back then, I was so thoroughly equipped to lead the people because I was skilled in the art of rhetoric where I would be able to lead them where they needed to go. But now, God, now I'm not equipped. Now I'm an old man, 80 years old. I'm no longer well learned in those various topics. I'm no longer well learned in the art of rhetoric. I've been talking to sheep for the past 40 years, God. Why are you calling me now? And Moses had a point. That if he couldn't deliver the Israelites back then when he seemed to be in the prime position to do this work, then why in the world would God call him to do this work now? And the crazy thing is that this wouldn't be the last time that God would make a head-scratching decision when it came to calling someone to serve him in the holy ministry. But throughout the history of the church, God has continued to call proven sinners to serve him in the holy ministry. Moses is one example, but we saw other examples of this in our other readings for today. In our second reading for this morning, we heard of Paul himself, who God had called into the holy ministry. And Paul spoke about how unlikely it was that God should call someone like him, the self-identified chief of sinners. Because in his past, he was one of the harshest persecutors of the Christian church, doing anything in his power to stop the spread of the gospel. And we heard in our gospel reading for today how Jesus himself called Matthew, who was a tax collector. And tax collectors back then were widely known as sinners because they used their position in a sinful way for their own personal gain. And God continues to call sinners into the holy ministry today. God has called a sinner like me to serve you, his people. And maybe that leads you to be filled with some uncertainty. Because if God has called a sinner to serve you and proclaim the gospel message to you and administer the sacraments to you, then can you really be certain that the work that I do is powerful and effective? And maybe it leads you to question God a little bit. Because you know that God could do things differently. If God wanted to, he could call his faithful angels to come and to do this work. And really, if God wanted to, he could come down into this world and do the work himself, proclaiming the gospel message and administering the sacraments to make sure that it's done correctly. But instead, God has decided to call sinners like Moses, Paul, Matthew, and me to serve you, his people. But this doesn't mean that you need to be filled with uncertainty about the work that I do. Because God calls sinners to serve him in the holy ministry, really to make it so that the credit goes where the credit is due, and to make sure all of the credit goes to God. And God promises to work through the sinful servants he calls into the holy ministry to bless this work so that it produces beautiful and amazing results. And it's this truth that God makes clear to Moses as our verses continue. That after Moses objected to God's decision to send him to deliver the Israelites, God says this to Moses: I will certainly be with you. And with these words, God was addressing Moses' basic problem. That Moses was so concerned about what he himself had to offer in this situation. But God wanted Moses to realize that he would be with him and that he would bless the work that Moses would do as his servant. And this is what would make the difference between success and failure. And by sending Moses now, at this time, now that it seemed like he was the worst possible person to send to do this work, was going to make this truth so much more evident to all of God's people. And Moses, in hearing that God would be with him, realized that God wasn't going to take no for an answer. But Moses still had another concern in mind. That what were the Israelite people going to think of him? Were they going to remember the awful sin that he had committed? Were they going to think of him as an imposter? Which is why Moses asked this question of God. That if I go to the Israelites and say to them, "The God of your fathers has sent me to you," and they ask me, "What is his name?" what should I say to them? And God gives Moses a beautiful answer that would allow him to really throw off any accusations that the Israelites would throw his way. And God answers in a way that distinguishes himself as the one true God, who Moses and all people can place their full trust and confidence. I am who I am. He also said, "You will say this to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you." God also told Moses, "Say this to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. And this is my name forever, and this is how I am to be remembered from generation to generation." That God reveals himself as a timeless, constant, and unchanging personal being. And he reveals himself in this way to reassure Moses and all of God's people that he is the God who would accomplish the promise that he had given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That he is the God who would bring spiritual deliverance from sin. And the deliverance that God was soon going to accomplish for his chosen nation, delivering them from their slavery in Egypt through his servant Moses, really pointed ahead to this greater deliverance that God would one day accomplish for his people. And God was going to accomplish this deliverance, this greater spiritual deliverance, by sending the right man for the job. Sending his very own Son into the world, who is God himself taking on flesh. True God and true man. A true man so that he could be born under the law and take our place. And true God so that after he lived that perfect life in our place, he could go to the cross and shed his holy and precious blood as the perfect sacrifice to win forgiveness and the redemption for the sins of the world. That this is how God would deliver you and me from our greatest spiritual enemy. And let us rejoice that the forgiveness which Christ won on the cross not only covers those of us who are in the holy ministry, but his grace also covers those of you who are in the pews as well. And because of what Christ has done and accomplished for us, this really gives all of us so much comfort. Because this means that no matter who your pastor was, is, or will be in the future, you can know that this is the right man for the job. Not because of who they are, but because of who God is. That the God of love, grace, and mercy has called a sinner to serve you, to proclaim the gospel message to you, and to administer the sacraments to you. And God promises to work through the work of my sinful hands to produce amazing results, creating and planting faith in your hearts, strengthening that faith, all so that you can be led to your eternal home in heaven. Amen.